Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Amber Elizabeth Gray. So Amber has been recommended to me. She is a long-time practitioner of many different body arts, particularly dance movement therapy, I believe, somatic psychology, something called life impressions, bodywork, craniosacral yoga, shiatsu, continuum, the late great Emily Conrad's work. She is a specialist in trauma and has worked in trauma all over the world. Worked with something called the Trauma Resources International, the Center for Victims of Torture, all kinds of trauma work. So trauma, I think, is going to be our main topic today. So Amber, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's dive in. How did you get interested in the body? What was your route to that?
How did I get interested in the body? I think it's because I had one. And it was a bit of a mystery at times. When I was actually kind of a nerdy academic little kid, and at the same time I was someone who always loved to dance but didn't quite, and actually loved physical activity. I would just say I loved running, loved swimming, but never did well at team sports or anything like that, and grew up in a really competitive place. I grew up in Wilton, Connecticut, which is the Stepford Wives was written about some towns in that area.
Okay.
If you know that story. So a lot of different pressures. And what actually happened when I was about 16 years old, I was in a really bad car accident, which at the time, I don't think I acknowledged this, but I can look back now, and I had some pretty intense, immediate physical impairment, a lot of scars on my face, a lot of pain, and had to work through that in a community that actually was very not very supportive, is what I will say. So I always look back at that accident and say that was sort of my being broken wide open, that I learned a lot. I mean, even now I'm dealing with physical pain that arises from those kinds of, very severe injuries that happened back at a time when there was no PTSD back then. There was a concussion. They didn't know a lot about traumatic brain injury. Anyways, all that to say, I had to come to terms with a body that was suddenly changed and couldn't do just everything that a teenage kid's body could do. Mm-hmm. So I think that was an introduction to my understanding that no matter how cerebral or intellectual or academic or creative or artistic or anything that we are, that our experience of being who we are is an embodied experience. I mean, it lives and roots and breathes in the body. So it's the challenges of that I think.
Okay, so that was your first kind of like confrontation perhaps with the body. Yep. And what were some of the first arts you got into? Like, I know you studied continuum, for example, which people actually interviewed Emily Conrad some years ago. Got on really well with her, just found her really juicy. And then, you've done yoga, shiatsu, things that people might have heard of. Like, what was the kind of I find most people have a kind of first love in embodiment. Which was yours?
Dance. It was dance, but it was wild dance. I mean, I years later, when I learned about Isadora Duncan, I'd say there was some part of me that was connecting to her. When I was little, I used to sneak outside. We spent a lot of summers in Cape Cod, and I would sneak outside, especially if it was windy, and go down to the beach. And I loved to dance, like there were rock jetties going out. And so I'd love to dance on the rocks or dance to the wind or dance to the ocean. And I always loved to dance. I'd go to dance parties, and I would actually at parties, all I would do is dance. So of course, in high school and things like that, people would talk about it, that odd,
the dancer girl.
All kinds of projections.
There was always kind of one who was like all kids dance, but then as they get a bit older, it's often one or two people who are like the dancers. And how did dance become dance therapy for you?
What happened is I continued to dance through college and anywhere that I went. So from college, I went into international humanitarian work, did some think tank work, did some work with the Peace Corps, and anywhere that I was in the world, I would try to find dance classes. Even if I didn't really like them, I'd go, take a bus to Guatemala City from my remote village on a weekend and take whatever dance classes were in town. So I love to dance. I was never going to be a professional dancer, wasn't built for it at that time. But what happened is as I went into international development and did more of that work, I became very disenchanted because I think international development tends to be very colonialistic.
Uh-huh.
It's a really colonial approach. So
Yeah, I spent 3 years in the humanitarian sector and kind of crawled out of it quite cynical and traumatized. And I'm wondering if your journey was somewhat cynical, somewhat similar.
oh yeah, I mean, it was, I was disgusted by a lot of what I saw.
Yeah.
So I had chosen public health and I was going in that direction, and then ended up leaving a position in Honduras, just, disgusted with what I was calling, colonialism, just modern day colonialism. And I decided I didn't know what I wanted to do because I wanted to do everything. I wanted to do acupuncture. I wanted to do herbal medicine. I met some herbal, some brujas down in Honduras, some people who were doing earth medicine. Was really interested in all of that. So I ended up going to bodywork school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, massage therapy school. I had traveled around the whole country looking at acupuncture. I was thinking of going to medical school, going to be a clinical psychologist. I was looking at everything that might have been an option. And I literally walked into, used to be called the Shears Institute. It's now called the Santa Fe School of Massage. And I walked in and they said, oh, you can try a class. And I sat in on this class with this amazing naturopath named Asher Katz, who I still go to. And I was like, I'm going to this school. It was the least probably academic choice, because I was going from, a job, a 9-to-5 job, and my master's degree into something that I remember my parents going, body work? You're going to school to be a massage therapist? But it was the body. It was really the body. And what I realized is that I wanted to understand the class, Asher's class. He had such a profound understanding of all the signals and the cues that are constantly streaming through the human body. And that really excited me. So it was a bit of a plunge into an ocean of the unknown, but just knowing that there was something about working with body medicine that I was interested in. And that was just a pause. I knew I didn't want to be a body worker forever. But so as I think about 10 years of body work and then slowly melting back into some international assignments very cautiously, only in situations where I was confident that I could do some good work. I was again at a crossroads and not sure what I wanted to do. And it's a story I've told often. I was in Rwanda right after the genocide and had a particularly grueling trip to a village that we were supposed to do an assessment in, and we were the first team in there. And some of the people on the team were the kind of people that who were the reason that I left international work. I call them the Rambo types, ignored all the security, took side roads where they hadn't been cleared yet for landmines, and, real macho bullshit.
Yeah, people don't realize there's quite a kind of macho and kind of military type influence on humanitarian work, like in terms of certain parts of it, particularly. People might not realize that, but yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's people who go in and they've got some savior
There's weird psychological agendas, isn't there? Isn't like saving the poor brown people, or maybe they just want to be in a place where they can be wild and won't be, have the normal kind of societal regulations. There isn't, what's that wonderful book, Missionaries, Misfits, and Mercenaries?
Yeah, and then there's one about, I forget, about sex and drugs and international aid. I mean, there's
emergency sex, that one.
Yeah, that one. So, and so anyways, long story, we get to this community and these little kids who were left in the community welcomed us with a song and dance. And they had a few shards of metal that they were playing like instruments, and there was just this extraordinary connection. And, it's, I think I very idealistically and naively felt that connection. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to go to school for dance movement therapy. I'd been to Naropa. I'd looked at the school. I could see the door of the university. I was like, that's where I'm going to go. And I mean, it was a bit idealistic because I thought, oh, that connection that I felt, which was very real. I think I also thought, well, maybe that's all I would have to do. I could come back. I wanted to come back into this world, into international work. and be able to foster that kind of a connection in people who had suffered the kinds of losses and horror that the people of Rwanda did. These little children had lost their entire community.
Yeah.
So that's really, I mean, that it was literally one of those moments where I was paying attention enough to and I followed it. I went back, I wrote the application. It's the only school I applied to.
People might not know Naropa because I'd say about 50% of everyone's European here. And, you know, we have a lot of people listening in from Germany, UK, Holland, Sweden. And like Naropa's not that well known. I've briefly been there. It's in Boulder, Colorado, right? And it's kind of has this Buddhist background and it's pretty
Yes.
kind of place.
Yeah, Trungpa Rinpoche started it with Allen Ginsberg. Yeah, it's a great school. Not a perfect school, but it's a great school. So, and I was living in Colorado. I was a body worker. So but that's how the dance became therapy is, and actually I was a little bit of a outlier in the sense that at that time, a lot of dance therapists came from strong ballet modern backgrounds. Dance therapy originally, you know, it was born of the dance. And so one of the things that I've been really committed to is, a lot of people don't like this word. I mean, my form of dance is wild. I mean, Haitian and African dance is what I do. I never really fit into the ballet or the modern world. And I appreciate that, but I've also been quite committed to the psychology side of dance movement therapy and really professionalizing it or grounding some of what we do with dance in the context of working with really severe trauma. So dance therapy used to draw mostly dancers, and now it's a field that's opening up.
Yeah, because it was kind of originally you kind of had like the therapists who realized the body was important, and they were like the body therapists from kind of right onwards. And then you had the dance movement therapists who were mostly sort of dancers coming from ballet, modern, maybe contemporary backgrounds. And they took their ballet shoes off, but they had still been thoroughly trained as Western dancers before they then, and then often there was a sort of a period where it was like, was regarded as a bit fluffy or flaky and a bit kind of like, oh, they're just kind of like movementy people who have learned a bit of psychology. And now it seems like over the last few years, it's been really professionalizing as a field. And, you know, interestingly, trauma, I think, is one of those things that's really brought the body back to psychotherapy, hasn't it? Like Bessel van der Kolk's, you know, seminal thing, the body keeps a score. And then after that, therapists were like, well, hang on a minute, we can't ignore the body with trauma. And you know, trauma's become this massively hot topic, which hopefully we'll get onto. I mean, trauma work that's your bread and butter now, right?
That is absolutely. It's you know, I work with trauma. I always like to say that I work with life, because one of the things that can drive me crazy about, you know, there's growing somatic practices that focus on trauma. And one thing that way in which I've been humbled is to recognize that, trauma is very significant.
Yeah.
Life-changing. It's a huge impact on someone's life that changes life forever. And I kind of prefer to say that I'm working with life, in the sense that I think a lot of what trauma work is reordering life, or restoring certain aspects of a person's life after they've been through the dramatic and profound and often, you know, and very painful changes that trauma induces. So
can we take a step back and just define terms a little bit? Because I'm aware the audience are pretty, you know, some of them are trauma experts. I myself have a trauma education background, but not a therapy background. And, you know, it's a word that's bandied around these days a lot. Like everyone's traumatized, everyone's triggered. Like what is trauma?
I'm glad you said that, because I mean, part of the way I define it is to say that not everybody's traumatized. It's one of the first things that I'll say when I'm teaching is trauma. You know, we could all be sitting in a room and go through the same experience or event, and not necessarily everybody needs to be, not everyone is necessarily going to be traumatized. The way I'm describing trauma now, I mean, we know it's not the event, and then a lot of people say, well, it's the body. It's actually a convergence. It's a meeting point. It's a moment in time. And I think this is really important, because how I am right now in meeting a certain event will be very different than how I was yesterday or how I was tomorrow. So it's a moment of exposure. And the exposure is to something that we perceive as either dangerous or life-threatening. And in a danger situation, we respond with fear. And in a life-threatening situation, we respond with terror. And what happens is a physiological response a spirit given, bio given, the mystery of life. It's something that appears to be universal. All human bodies will physiologically assemble, to some extent disassemble. We know certain things happen with the brain and the nervous system and the hormones. There are very fast changes that organize our body to either mobilize in response to danger, which is the fight flight, or immobilize, shut down if it's a perceived as a true life threat. That's an imprint. And so what happens in the body at that moment is what saves our asses, basically. A lot of people, I always say, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not pathological. It's good. That's why we're still here. But the ongoing imprint that might remain if a person doesn't have an opportunity, time, support, rest, community, maybe it's therapy, maybe it's prayer, whatever it is, to restore balance is a word that's often used, but to restore the natural beat of the body. I always say we lose our beat, and if we don't regain our original beat, if we stay locked, what I look at trauma as almost being locked in that fear response.
Yeah, that's usually how I explain it in a way that's fairly straightforward and simple. Is like, hey, we have this kind of fight-flight response. It's a normal response, but if we get locked in it, that's not adaptive. That's not healthy for our day-to-day life. The idea usually I hear it presented is it's not just something a bit scary, but it's something overwhelming, right?
Yeah, overwhelming is a good word.
Yeah, and it's weird because it's partly got an external definition, like something life-threatening or threatening to life or limb or integrity of self. I've heard it described as like a rape, for example. But it's also, there's an external part of the definition, but it's also tremendously subjective because, as you said, two people may be both in the same trench when a shell hits nearby and one of them gets traumatized and the other one doesn't at all. And I've definitely been around instances where I was kind of surprised who got traumatized and who didn't. And then there's an acute response, which people may have. And then there's a more long-term chronic response, which, as you say, is like someone's lost their beat. They've lost they're a little bit stuck in this particular way of being. And that might get called something like post-traumatic stress disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, that are the sort of terms that you hear, which are words for kind of like groupings of different trauma symptoms, like the numbing and the hyperarousal. There's many trauma symptoms, but that get grouped together and called something like PTSD, which people might say, oh, they've got trauma at that point. So sort of, are we roughly on the same page here?
We are. I mean, I
make some terms for everyone out there, because I kind of get annoyed with how loosely some of this stuff is getting talked about these days. And I kind of like, it's nice to have a real professional on that can say, yeah, this is how.
No, it drives me crazy. And traumatization, I mean, I think people can be traumatized and not meet a clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
If you haven't slept for 3 years, if you're afraid to leave your room, there's a level of traumatization that isn't a clinical diagnosis. So yes, and not everybody is traumatized. I mean, I can have a good day in the trench and I can have a really shit day in the trench, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. It's that meeting point. It's the moment of how does my body, physiology, but also personality and psyche and spirit and all of who I am, how does it meet that moment in time, which is the exposure?
Yeah, and there's an element of meaning, and there's an element of how, just like physical factors. Like, I remember some things that happened to me in Ethiopia, and some of the really bad things I wouldn't talk about on air, but didn't traumatize me. But there was other things. Like, I remember one day I just walked out of my house and there was like a dead horse kind of in the street that was kind of being eaten by dogs. Now, on the surface, that's not the worst thing I saw. But there was something about that moment in time where I was run down, and it was symbolic. That's one thing that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that it's not necessarily the things people think of.
Right.
But I'm definitely a fan of not using the word casually. People say, I couldn't get any traumatized at the shop, and it's
so thank you, because it people, it drives me crazy when people say, well, everybody's traumatized these days.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big assumption, but perception is a big component of it. And I'm not always sure that I even always understand perception, but it is that perceived, what is our perception in that moment? I mean, how are we meeting that experience? One of my operative questions is, how do I meet the world? And it's not just in regards to trauma, but that's kind of part of my own daily, self work that I do with myself. Some people don't like the term self-care. I think it's a really important term. part of my spiritual practice, part of how movement, authentic movement, continuum. I'm always asking, how do I meet the world? And I think
Yeah.
that's part of what we're talking about with what becomes traumatization. How did I meet that moment? And it's not weak, it's not strong. It just is, what happened in that particular moment. It's just maybe we were a little more vulnerable or a little more open.
Mm. And who are you kind of working with now? Like, I know you've worked with victims of torture, you've worked with, like I have with NGOs. Like how are you working with this day to day? Is it more like therapy, or is it education you're doing, or how's it going?
Well, all of it. I still work. I work in New Mexico with refugees and survivors of torture. That's been my clinical practice for 20 years, and that's who I work with. Sometimes I will work with other people. Will find their way to me who have histories of, long-term, child trauma, child abuse, programming, ritual abuse, things like that, betrayal trauma. I'm doing a lot more education, a lot more educating. I'm actually coming to Europe to teach my restorative movement psychotherapy and polyvagal informed dance movement therapy. It's an approach to working with trauma that grew out of my years of doing this work. So I'm just finished teaching a series in Vancouver. I'm starting another one in Australia.
Almost big now. It's totally weird for me. 11 years ago, I met my main mentor in trauma work. He was working with abuse survivors. I thought it was weird. I knew him for Aikido, but I got interested in his work and I started learning the basics of trauma awareness. And all of a sudden I started seeing the world through, oh my God, these people are numb, or Israel, I'm going, wow, this whole country are hyper aroused. Or, like I'm looking at certain features of Russian culture, or I'm looking at things that are people around me of intimacy issues with girlfriends. And I'm going, oh shit, that's a trauma thing. And you start seeing trauma everywhere. And at the time, it used to drive me nuts that nobody had an awareness of it. And there was, a lot of not much compassion, basically. But in that time, certainly in the UK, it's become much more talked about, much more normal, which is good, on the whole. Like Peter Levine and Porges and Bezel van der Kolk, and these guys are rock stars.
Yeah.
These guys are hard to get hold of for this podcast. We'll get a couple of them on, I think, at some point, but they're hard to get hold of because they're doing talks for thousands of people. They're on book tours. And, on the one hand, credit to them. They've done some great work for putting that out there. So I'm not going to badmouth any of these guys. And, they're getting rewards from years of hard work. So again, I'm not going to badmouth them. And it's a very different situation now from 10 years ago in terms of sort of auto stadium filling trauma rock stars. That's not a phenomenon that existed 10 years ago.
That's true. That's an interesting way to look at it. Well, part of it, I think, is just what society does. And again, all three of them are people who I've worked with and know and adore. And so the work is really important. And there's a tendency, I'm just thinking in general of the human condition and how we just Hollywoodize or rock starize or people. And, I think what's also good is there's a lot of people who are not necessarily rock stars who are teaching and taking the messages and the research. It's interesting because it does tend to be research focused. The rock star syndrome research focused seems to be mostly men.
Yeah, that's true. If I think of those names I mentioned, they're all guys. There's Babette Rothschild, isn't there, as well, who's kind of big in this field. But,
And I always get interested in who's actually doing the work in the really sort of mainstream or pedestrian ways. Who's carrying the work quietly? And I think that's, I know one of the things that I've been a champion of is I studied somatic experiencing right after I finished at Naropa, which is Peter's work. Peter's a friend of mine. And my degree's in somatic psychology, and all of this is still very much exists in a Western vacuum. It very much exists in a Western world. Dance movement therapy, a lot of dance therapists will talk about, well, we draw from the power of dance and ancient practices. Yes, we do. It's still been very categorized, organized in a Western world. Most of my work has been very cross-cultural. And what I'm really excited about is getting out of the pretty therapy office, out of the gymnasium that packs thousands. What does it look like on the streets? What does it look like in places like Haiti, where I've worked, or Darfur, or when I was working,
I mean, or even just kids in East London who are,
right.
crumping, dancing hip hop and dancing urban kind of street
Yeah.
dance, and
Yeah.
not kind
What
of
is
like
it?
pretty liberal middle class dance.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what's been really interesting. And I think, so we've got all that great energy, and people are learning and gravitating, towards the people who are the rock stars, as you say. And then how does it trickle down and get into places where it really helps people? And I think and I have to say, Stephen Porges is amazing. He's a good friend of mine.
Those guys all look like lovely guys. I did a selfie with Gabor Mate at a conference recently and chatted to him, and it's like all these people. I'm not a bad thing to say about any of them. I just find it a weird situation,
Well, it is, and what I love and appreciate about him is his sincere. I mean, his heart.
Yeah.
He really wants his work. I mean, he knows what his role is. He's a phenomenal. I mean, he's transformed the world of trauma treatment more than anybody. And I think his work is brilliant. The polyvagal theory.
Do you want to briefly explain what that is? Because it's something we hear a lot about, and maybe people will know about it or not. Like polyvagal theory would be an interesting one to briefly mention.
Sure.
I doubt we'll get, unless you intro me, I doubt we'll get Stephen on. So it'd be nice for people to hear what that is, because it's for example, I'm hearing it misused by yoga teachers who have read about it in a book. So it'd be nice to kind of clarify what exactly it is.
Okay. Yeah, and what I was just going to say about Stephen is I know his heart's what his heart wants his work to help people. I mean, that's why he's doing it, and I know that. So the polyvagal theory, I mean, that's a theory that describes Stephen's work, and he's got a book called the Polyvagal Theory, and he just came out with the handbook of the polyvagal theory, which is written more for clinicians. It's much less scientific. But in his research on, I mean, he originally was working with autism, but as he was looking at the autonomic nervous system, so the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, a lot of, and I'm not gonna, I didn't review my notes, but there's a lot of emphasis on the sympathetic adrenal response, so that he was noticing that in various people's research and writing over the years, people emphasize when there's a stress response or a fear response, whatever you want to call it, people tend to focus on the sympathetic adrenal. And going back, there was a guy named, I think it's William Cannon, was writing about voodoo death, and that had sort of been lost in the literature. And in reviewing that, he started to ask the question, is there another response that is not, I'm gonna use the word sympathetic adrenally driven, or when human beings are shocked or have a stress response. And so that's where what he calls immobilization and fear. So the polyvagal theory, the vagus nerve, which I think people have known about for years, he really gave us the understanding that the dual, it's polyvagal. Poly means many, vagus nerve, so that it has multiple branches. I mean, as nerves do. But that there's the ventral vagal circuit and the dorsal vagal circuit, and then that dorsal vagal circuit is what's responsible for that parasympathetically driven, and again, that's not scientific terms, I'm just sort of using it to describe it, a parasympathetic response to that perceived life threat. So in other words, many people for years were teaching that when we're working with trauma, that underneath whether somebody's in a fight flight state or a freeze state, there's always that sympathetic adrenal charge, the brake and the accelerator of the car. And he countered that and said, actually, there is a complete shutdown that happens where there's no sympathetic adrenal input to this, nervous system or to the human body. It's parasympathetic, it's dorsal vagal, where the person is completely shut down. And it's a very dangerous response, because humans, because of the demands on our body for oxygen, because of how complex a system we are, we cannot sustain being shut down for a long time. So polyvagal theory, 2 circuits. I always like to say it's 2 circuits, 3 pathways, and 5 states is the way I describe the polyvagal theory. Ventral vagal and dorsal vagal circuit, very important in understanding the vagus nerve and its physiological function and structure. The pathways are social engagement, mobilization, and immobilization, and the states are social engagement in a state of safety, mobilization in a state of safety or in a state of fear, immobilization in a state of safety or in a state of terror. I don't know if that was helpful. It's
I think it may have whetted people's appetites. So I'll suddenly put his. I'm going to make a note here now in terms of linking polyvagal theory. If people want to know more about that, then I'm sure they can find that from the links that I'll put on the site as well. Why don't we just talk kind of practical stuff here then? Like,
okay.
what works, like in terms of trauma resilience, so how not to get traumatized, and trauma treatment. Like, what do you, I know it really depends on the person and blah blah blah, but what is your best guesses as to what really works here? Because it seems like this is one of the ways the body came back into psychotherapy, because talking about it didn't work, right?
I think it's a combination of being, well, I think, you know what I think the most important thing is with body-based therapies is, and this is one of the things that concerns me, is so many of them, as there's sort of this explosion of different approaches and people, paralleling this explosion in a need for evidence-based practices and how things are organized. I think that what works is a therapist. To be an effective body-based therapist, we have to embody ourselves. We have to be in our own bodies. It's not so much about the theories and the information and the science are essential to understand, but it's how we literally inhabit our own bodies. So I think trauma treatment is most effective when the therapist or the facilitator or the practitioner is somebody who is, it's like that practicing what we preach kind of thing, is very intentionally spending time in their own practices, whether it's yoga or just, contemplative walking outside, just however we practice being in our bodies.
Yeah, there's a couple of parallels there. I think one was that study of therapists that said the best therapist was the one with the best therapeutic relationship. And it strikes me that the relationship to ourself is, also even more fundamental, right? So there's the relationship to self as a therapist, or in my case, a coach, and then the relationship with the client, right? Like those two things are way more important than the modality being used. And there's another one in mindfulness or so, which is fascinating, which was they looked at the stress reduction in a bunch of children taught by different teachers. And the teacher that was a mindfulness practitioner teaching mindfulness got the best result. The teacher who did taught mindfulness but wasn't a mindfulness teacher got a little bit of a result. And here's the really interesting one. The mindfulness practitioner who taught the children ancient history, which was a control, actually got the second best result. So just because of the fact that he was a mindful, like a deep embodied, mindfulness kind of long-term regular meditator, teaching them Egyptian history, I think it was, actually calmed the children down more than the person that was teaching them mindfulness but wasn't in their body or a long-term practitioner. And I thought that was an absolutely fascinating study, and it showed the power of like state transmission and the power of actually, okay, what is the person's practice who's doing the technique, right? Because you can do a trauma course or a yoga course or any kind of course pretty quickly these days, but that long-term kind of body-based practice that takes a lot longer.
Well, I think you just said the keyword state transmission, because in the work that I do and the work that I teach, and again, and I mean, this is drawing back from polyvagal. Stephen and I just co-authored a chapter. It's on polyvagal informed dance movement therapy. So we've developed some work together, and the essence of it is what I call state shifting. And so that's influenced by science, but it's also influenced by religion and spiritual practice for years. What did shamans do? I mean, what did shamans do? They facilitate state shifting. And I studied with a few in different, parts of the world. That's been another huge influence on my work, is working with medicine people. And it's about state shifting. And that's what I think effective. I don't want to minimize effective treatment to that, but it's the transmission. And more what I'm interested in is, what am I carrying and communicating? I wrote a piece maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years ago called "What Language Does Your Body Speak?" It was a shout out to the humanitarian world. It was kind of my, I took body-based practice and transmission, and I took it into the humanitarian context and was really asking people to consider, what are you really communicating? Because people, any of us, when we're in our most vulnerable state, that's when we're going to be most susceptible and most to being permeated by what other people bring in. So, we've known for years survivors of torture are exquisite at reading their therapist. because of the ways in which they've been broken, there's a sensitivity. I mean, I don't like to categorize or put everybody. Same thing when we show up in vulnerable situations, people are really will pick up. So what are we exuding? What are we giving off? Transmission is huge. And
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of self-compassion, and I've been doing a lot of I'm actually writing a few pieces that are going to come out in the next year. I'm working on a dissertation that focuses on the cultivation of self-compassion as actually the most important self-care therapeutic, but also in service of evolution. Because I really don't want to just be a good, I mean, I'm hoping I'm a helpful therapist.
Sure.
I hope I'm a reasonably good human being.
It's a bigger game though, right, than being good at your job.
Right. I want to be in service of evolution. And so what are we really doing here on the planet? And to me, this is where it comes down to embodiment and transmission. What am I always carrying and what am I always sharing, independent of what I think, I'm saying or thinking? I mean,
Yeah.
we are,
And that's why we want to spend time around it. Like, even just thinking of this as a trauma context, like, which of your friends do you want to spend time around? The smartest one?
Yeah.
Or the one who just makes you feel good because they're like warm to be around and they're loving?
Yeah.
Or the one who's fun and it's like, and you're with them and you just like, they're just fun, and I definitely know the power of this as well because I teach in a lot of countries where I have an interpreter, and I see the impact of what I'm doing before the interpreting happens. So I'll be like, da, 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 and the audience will laugh, and most of them don't speak English, and I'm like, okay, so that was a stage transmission from me to the audience. And sometimes translators trying to play catch up, and they're all laughing or crying or whatever the state I'm trying to get across is. And she's like, I haven't even translated yet. What the hell's happening? And I'm like, yeah, because that's the body. And we also have to train the translators to state transmit. So like a really good, so my translator is like my best friend in Moscow. She kind of like morphs into me, and she's normally this introverted, sort of shy lesbian girl, like completely different from me. And I add the lesbian bit because in Moscow that gay community tends to be quite small in their embodiment. And she's kind of morphs into me because she's like, that's the only way she can state transmit without like ruining the message of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely a key part there.
Yeah, no, I think, the word presence is tossed around a lot, mindfulness, just like trauma, it's all these words. And I think one of my favorite ways to define it actually comes from an article by Stephen Porges and Sherry Geller, is to consider that mindfulness is the constant, I'm going to use, this is me summarizing, the reflection. If I'm practicing self-compassion, my ability, and compassion, self-compassion seeds compassion, my ability to reflect that, express that, is what mindfulness is. And my ongoing ability to practice, to pay attention to how I'm showing up is what presence is.
That's nice. And I feel like attention has got a lot of the focus, and it feels like now there's more research being done on the kind of Brahma Viharas and the kind of like what we could call heart practices, like that kind of care piece. And it's, people might be a bit shocked to realize like the third sector, kind of humanitarian sector, particularly, often there isn't the self-love, like the macho kind of self-abuse in that sector. I've taught humanitarian sector in the UK pre-deployment and in the field in various places like you have. And, I talk about like the projection of vulnerability onto the other, for example. And therapists are also just demons for this. Like, I don't have a problem. I'm saved. It's like a kind of victim, kind of persecutor, kind of savior thing going on. And that kind of persecuting of vulnerability onto the other, and the complete lack of self-care, the high amount of addiction issues, for example, in the average, refugee camp where there's a bunch of aid workers working, like the amount of sex issues, the amount of uncontrolled anger issues. Like that stuff's all huge. And I wonder if some of that is around, there's a key piece, isn't there, around which is in a way just more extreme than the average person. But it's the same pattern of not really taking care of oneself.
Yeah, well, sometimes I remember I would often think of, the term self-loathing. What is that? Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. But the term self-loathing, it would often filter through my brain when I was overseas in humanitarian context. And I would look at people and go, my God, this is a war on self. What? Yeah, I think it's, It's quite chronic in the humanitarian world, and I don't, I don't want to be critical, but I don't know what it is. I'm because I'm actually taking a step back and really looking
Yeah.
at as I said, all of humanity. I mean, I really, I mean, I think being a good therapist, what works in trauma treatment, all of that. I mean, I'm very interested in clinical skill and clinical practices. But what I've heard myself say, I think I first said it like 3 or 4 years ago, was if we don't step into the full humanity of our personhood, why bother? Why
Yeah.
bother if I'm not actually showing up? And I think that's, and that's a big philosophical statement, but what does it really mean? Am I tending to myself in a way that ensures that who I am when I'm providing therapy to my clients, or buying groceries at the grocery store, upholds a human connection with another person, um, that is worthy of both of us? Did that make sense?
Yeah, and I like what you're jamming on here. Let me take it really practical in terms of just how do you take care of yourself doing this work? Because I, like most people do the humanitarian work, I ended up burnt out and traumatized and getting treatment. I did EMDR, I did some of the somatic treatments that are out there, so I can speak firsthand of those. And then I ended up sort of doing a little bit of the work, and like I heard you say earlier, choosing the jobs much more carefully, a lot less macho, a lot less, being much more careful around some of the jobs I choose. And I really limit it now. Like I normally do one a year somewhere rough. Like I'm going to Ukraine soon to see my wife's family there. I'll probably get pulled in to work with some soldiers in her hometown because I normally do when I'm there.
Right, right.
It's all her mates she went to school with. I'm not going to say no to that. And but I generally about once a year I'm somewhere like in field like that now, and that's kind of enough for me because I find it's hard to be resilient in the face of so much pain and trauma. And you're around a lot more of it than I am. Most of my work is just like business dudes, stress management courses and things like that. So, like, what are your kind of secrets for staying sane in the face of so much pain?
One of the things I realize is that it's not something that I schedule or do. So, self-care is often the last half hour of a PowerPoint presentation. It's the last workshop at the end of a conference. And my training program starts with it. And it starts with it not just as, these are things, that you do. I mean, it's not a list. It's not something I schedule. I
Have a
do
bubble
it all
bath
the
once a
time.
week with candles. Like, that's not going to fucking cut it, is it?
I practice self-care with my clients. I practice self-care when I'm on airplanes. I
Yeah.
practice self-care. The best place to practice it is out in the field. So, I mean, there's certain things that I do that are definitely I don't think of it as self-care time, but taking walks, I'm really good about. I love animals. I love my dogs. I walk them every day. I have floor time with them. I've started rescuing dogs. I dance. I mean, I keep dancing.
Yeah, your Facebook is full of dogs. I was wondering what the dog thing was today, but there is that trauma link.
Well, I started, yeah, and I've actually thought, God, should I set up a different Facebook? Like
No, I love dogs. I love
unprofessional.
dogs.
But I rescue dogs. But I spend a lot of, but dance. I mean, I do dance,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's been to a point where I might be tired. I have one class that I've gone to for years, 7 at night, and my husband will look at me and he'll be like, "You're going to dance class."
Yeah, I have a ritual where there's a church that me and my wife dance in sometimes. It's an old church near our house. They dance 5 rhythms, and I always dance there before and after I do a job anywhere kind of hairy or colorful. I kind of, have it's like a ritual before and after. And as you say, even things like the like I'll do one where I change out of my work clothes immediately and shower. Like these kind of little rituals, like going for a walk, to let the body kind of digest the experience. And then there's also just setting boundaries around like how much work I do. I remember doing one job in Sierra Leone, and it was like 10 days in a row with 25 traumatized soldiers. I just wouldn't take that job now. Like I would be like, I want an assistant. I want a break after 3 days. That self-care wouldn't be at the end. Self-care would be how that job was set up. You know what I mean? Like in terms of the day structure, the number of hours, the number of people, the ratios, to the therapist and things. So, as you say, like I think seeing self-care as like a tag on, as you say, either to the presentation or to the end of your day, like, oh, I've brutalized myself all day. Now I have to do something nice for myself. Yeah. It's sort of a little bit late at that point, isn't it? It needs to be much more.
Well, that's punitive. That's part of, that's just, I mean, it's, yeah, and, I don't want to, I look at a lot of the big world religions and, all these practices where people, self-flagellate, whether it's physically or emotionally or psychologically, or go without things. And I go, what is that? And it's not that, about being gluttonous for pleasure, but I mean, why are we here? So the more that we're able to commit to our own constant curiosity and engagement with the world in ways that are pleasing or pleasurable or fun. I have fun with my clients. I actually
people don't realize it's a lot of fun around trauma work, don't they?
I play. I mean, play is mobilization without fear from the polyvagal perspective. And and I remember one of my clients said to me once, this is a long time ago, it got revealed to me at a program that I was working in that clients were actually telling each other, these were pre-clients, actually, they were going to come in for their intakes. They would say, try to get Amber. She's a comedian. And the word sort of got out. But one of the clients actually said, that, we're grateful because we don't need to be reminded about our suffering. We're never going to forget that.
Yeah.
Reminded to laugh and to dance and where the beauty is. And she said, I come into your office and it's all here. There's color, there's dance, your laughter. And I've been criticized. I mean, I was criticized, by some actually fairly big names in the field at one point about, trauma light. And, I sit here now 20 years into the field.
And I feel like Paul Linden, this is part of the Jewish tradition, which kind of, it's come through Paul to me. He's one of my main teachers. He tells some awful jokes, but he tells them in a certain way at a certain point in the therapeutic process where they're useful. So it's not like an avoidant strategy of, I don't want to go there emotionally. Right. And for me, I've always thought humor was massive because if you can laugh at something, you have power over it. It doesn't have power over you.
Exactly. And what's effective trauma treatment, right? It's
getting that distance so you're not caught in that thing.
Yeah, and you're no longer captive.
And I see the particularly American culture, if I'm going to be a little broad brushstroke here, but it can take itself quite seriously around this stuff.
So fucking seriously. Sorry, no,
I'm with you. And it's I hope you don't mind me saying this, but there's something that, and I said the only place I've seen this is from Jewish friends of mine who have another cultural root, or Irish friends, definitely. And it feels like that if that humor gets missing, something's up there and it all gets a little bit stiff. And the best trauma therapist I know is one, Shoshana Garfield, I know in Britain, who works with hardcore abuse cases. She's just always telling jokes. And I actually have to tell her to calm it down a bit amongst some of my other friends because I'm like, they don't think the trauma jokes are funny. You're going to scare them, But it's, there's a real place for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's timing is important. I mean, it's not that I talk about humor in trauma treatment. It's part of what it's part of what I do and part of what I teach. It's there's times, but clinical intuition is huge. I mean, I think I don't like the word clinical judgment. I use the word clinical intuition. And we know, I mean, if we're really paying attention to ourselves and we're really present with our clients, we know, and it can actually be very helpful to insert some humor or to allow something to be funny. I mean, that's to me, that's when life, that's why I like to say I work with life. It's like sparks of life bubbling up when humor comes into the room, or when play, or.
I think there's a risk of a sort of like, okay, I'm still seeing two worlds out there now. Now there's two worlds. There used to just be no one knew about trauma. Now there's still the same old-fashioned denial of trauma. So I had Bezel van der Kolk talking about this recently, like the denial of trauma that exists in the British military, for example, that exists in parts of the US government, or yoga teachers who are totally trauma uninformed and just grabbing their students, and martial arts teachers that have no idea of trauma survivors are coming in an attempt to heal to martial arts classes, or they're doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu and they've got someone pinned to the floor, and the idea that this person may have been raped at some point in their life just doesn't even occur to them, which is horrifying statistics. So on the one hand, we've just got this huge group of just ignorant, either willfully in denial, or just innocently they don't know. Like the average Aikido teacher just doesn't know. It's not his fault. You know what I mean? Like he hasn't thought about it unless he took a class with Paul Linden or whoever. And then on the other hand, I'm seeing like this super sensitive kind of Berkeley set, I call them, who are kind of like super liberal, super sensitive. Everything's trauma. I once had someone make a complaint because there was a mirror in the room of a studio that I was working in. And I'm like, really? Your own reflection is scaring you now? Like, and it wasn't like a trauma sensitive workshop. It was just a regular workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not ideal to have a mirror in there, but I was like, seriously, I have to cover every mirror in the room that I'm ever going to be in from now on.
Yeah.
And everyone's triggered. Like, do I have to put a fucking trigger warning on this episode because we've talked about some stuff? You know, like it just seems like these two extremes. Thoughts, comments, interpretations.
No, I mean, I've observed the same thing, and I think I can be a little bit cynical about those things. I get cynical, and I think, maybe somebody needs a certain kind of dose of reality, and then I think, I don't know what that person's suffering is. I mean, I can do both, because I do think people get way into, it's like covering yourself with those what's that stuff, the antibacterial stuff, It's like, cover yourself with that and just go out into the world. I think, again, I look at the whole planet, and I just think we have a tendency right now to be in some extremes. I mean, extremism is really good right now. And are we going to be driven by fear? Are we going to, meet the world with fear? Or are we going to meet it with openness and curiosity? So I tend to think I'm pretty direct when people come to my class, and there is a lot of that going on. A lot of that, I feel like they're going to be overly precious.
Yeah.
I've asked people to leave. I've actually said, because I'm not going to, the more, I guess enabling would be the word here. I'm not going to enable that kind of behavior, because I think it's separation. It's separation behavior. It's not.
I also want to assume robustness as well, right? Like, if I'm interviewing you, I'm assuming that you're a professional, that you're an adult, that you may have trauma experiences, but that, like, I want to treat you with the respect of you're a grown-up. Do you know what I mean? And I would love that you treat me that way back. Not like, I have to be really delicate with her because in case she's had a bad experience. It's like, no. This is a normal adult context. It's not a therapeutic context. Like, I just want to be like two adults having a conversation here.
Right.
And actually, I'd find it disrespectful if you treated me with kid gloves.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I've had clients come to me who've said that they're recovering from therapists who treated them that way. Like, everything was, are you okay? Or I run retreats sometimes, and often in my retreats, I run retreats that are specifically for survivors of trauma. Even if they're not, usually there are some people who've survived traumatic experiences, and it drives them crazy when people are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to watch every move. And having a conversation and, being able to laugh and cry and kind of spar with each other, that's life. That's what people long to do.
Yeah, same with kids, if you're like rough and tumbling with them, they love it, and letting them kind of fall off their skateboards a bit and things like that, because they realize, like, unconsciously in their systems, that's how you develop robustness and resilience is, while within the boundaries of it's respectful, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so let's be useful to people listening. So there's going to be all kinds of embodiment practitioners listening to this. Some of them yoga teachers, dance teachers, martial artists. Let's assume the majority aren't kind of trauma professionals, but they're body professionals.
Okay.
What are some of the things you think, like, whether it's a massage therapist or an Aikido teacher, like, what are some of the things that would be really helpful for them to know about trauma? Because they're not going to become a trauma therapist, most of them, right? Or maybe not even read kind of, the polyvagal theory book or whatever, but like some simple things like respecting boundaries of clients, for example.
Right.
What are some simple things we can kind of offer out to everyone listening?
Well, I think I'm gonna riff off of respecting boundaries with clients, and starts first by saying know your own boundaries. Mm-hmm. I think the most important thing we can all do is know our own boundaries, our own limits. Be really clear about what our role is, and I think in some ways roles are blurring. Body workers sometimes study somatic experiencing, or we sometimes we're laying on a table where if we're the client, we're vulnerable, so we might open up. But to really know our boundaries in terms of what we're comfortable working with and addressing, I think that's one of the most important things. And also knowing what makes us feel safe, or I like to use the term relative safety. That's just sort of my acknowledging that the world is never an entirely safe place, but making sure that the environment that I'm working in supports me to feel safe enough, strong enough, supported enough.
Yeah.
If I'm a little tired, if I'm a body worker, do I need to wear shoes with better support that day? Is there a certain tape that I need to play? If I'm a therapist and I'm like, oh my God, why did I schedule my day in this way? And I've got these 2 or 3 really difficult clients. Is my water filled? Do I have enough snacks to eat between sessions? Can I spray the room with something that smells really nice? Or do I?
You're resourced.
Yeah.
What about it? I recommend Rebecca Rothschild's Help for the Helper as well. I think it's designed for therapists, but I think it's good for everyone. And in terms of like working with people, there's things like, I tell martial arts teachers I know, if you have a student and you grab them and you're practicing a grabbing move and they totally freak out, then maybe there's a trauma issue there. If they go limp and don't respond in any way, they're kind of, in a total freeze kind of shutdown response, and they're not listening to you, they're not just stupid. They might not be able to hear you for another reason,
Right. Well,
if you have a female student that doesn't, or a male student that doesn't want to practice a pin, respect that, like you might not know the reason for that. Like, these are things I would tell a martial arts teacher that would be news to them, actually.
Well, pay attention to the cues, as the cues that tells you whether you're safe, and that also tells whether or not your person, your student, your client, your friend, whoever it is, whether or not they feel safe. I mean, that's what I hear you saying, is we need to pay attention to cues. It also goes back to that state transmission. I mean, is somebody responsive to me? Are they making eye contact, if that's part of whatever we're engaged in? Are they, are they still breathing in a way that there seems to be a comfortable way of breathing? Yeah, paying attention to the cues. And checking in. I think a lot of people are afraid to check in. And again, there's that, well, maybe I'm not a therapist, so I don't want to get a whole history, but just checking in, even if it's a quiet practice, it can be really helpful to say, hey, I just want to check in. How are you doing? I always say, when in doubt, it's important to check in. If there's anything telling me, and because most of us have that. If we're not quite certain, if we're in an uncomfortable position, and if trauma does show up, just check in and say, wait a minute. Yeah, I'm feeling kind of nervous in my stomach. Pause. How are you doing? I just want to check in.
I guess another really important one for me is like really respecting consent, like realizing there's a power hierarchy in most kind of classes like dance, martial arts, yoga, and really getting like, are you sure they want an adjustment? If I say to someone, hey, it's all right if I adjust you, yeah? They're going to be like, yeah, because you're the authority figure. And I've been taught through years of abuse that I have to say yes to authority figures, particularly if they're older men, whatever it is, right? And as opposed to like the opt-in versus the opt-out, and like, because you can actually beautifully teach agency through a yoga class, for example, by being like, hey, stop when you want. If you don't want to do this, here's an alternative. You don't have to. You know what I mean? Like, you can actually do, rather than like not traumatize people, you can be like beautifully teaching people's responsibility and ownership of their own bodies,
I think that's probably the most important thing. I mean, you asked at some point, I think about trauma treatment. And in some ways, I think what you just said, there it is.
Yeah.
If however we're working with people or meeting people or playing with people or dancing, we're being self-respect of our body, however that is for us, and teaching or role modeling, and particularly like that term, or modeling that. Yeah, there it is.
As you say, that's what we're teaching implicitly. And I think it's worth embodiment teachers realizing that trauma survivors may be disproportionately represented. Like if you've had traumatic instances of assault, you may well be in martial arts. Or if you have a lot of hyperarousal, you may be going to dance to jump around and kind of get rid of it. Or just, if you have numbing, you may go to a very intense yoga class. Just it's the only way you can feel anything. So I think it's also worth bearing in mind people may be overrepresented in these kind of environments,
Yeah, well, and it wouldn't be surprising, because people who are, again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but traumatized may be seeking a way to connect to their bodies. That's the way, that's the road home, right? And so whether it's conscious or unconscious, many of us, are drawn, whether it's because we hear that yoga is great for this or Tai Chi is great for that, or whether
there's a healing urge, isn't there? That's even if it's unconscious, it somehow directs people towards these things, and that's dangerous as well as beautiful. I mean, anything else you find just really effective? Like, do you rate like TRE or the tapping or somatic experiencing you've mentioned? I mean, are there any things that you feel like, you know what, these are really like top class embodied kind of therapies for trauma?
Well, I would say dance movement therapy. I mean, I think dance movement therapy is it's because it's profoundly holistic. And so one of my current missives, if you will, is I think, and one of the reasons I've been doing as much writing as I have is because I think dance therapy, which has been around since the 40s in terms of its Western packaging, it's because it's so comprehensive. I mean, it
covers a lot, right? It really covers a lot. I think that's been the problem in the research, hasn't it? Like trying to, because so much depends on who the practitioner is and what they're doing. It doesn't fit into the neat CBT 8 sessions model.
Right.
Helen Payne in England is doing some cool stuff, like trying to kind of assess it. We share a student, so.
I'm just finishing a chapter for her book. She's actually waiting for me to get it.
She seems really nice. Like we've got awesome. a Turkish student who I'm very good friends with. Who's a student of hers and mine. But so she's another person with resources and things out there. Maybe we should get her on the show. Actually,
get her on the show. But I think dance movement therapy, it's a really, I mean, it's a well-developed psychological therapy. So I'm trained in, somatic experiencing, and I know that there's a lot of different sort of trauma-focused little packages out there. I don't think they're as complete as dance movement therapy. Somatic psychology is it's a whole field, but a lot of people get scared of the word dance. But dance simply is about the fact that life is a creative process, and that how we express. I always say every inhale and exhale is a dance.
Yeah, some people just call it movement therapy, don't they? And I think that takes away the trigger for a lot of people there, just calling it, because everything's movement, right? And you want your trauma to move, you want your life to move. We're always moving. Right. So that I think for some people is less. Maybe I'm just being optimistic here, but I really think that movement therapy is kind of going to come to the fore in the near future. I have a sense that it's in the same way sort of CBT kind of shot up at some point. I feel like maybe its time has finally come, I
think so.
Like the science has caught up enough that it can be kind of validated in ways where it didn't used to maybe when it started. But maybe that's just wishful thinking. But
no, I think you're right.
In the evening, I'm going to let myself have a positive thought.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, Hannah Kamiya, made a film called The Moving Child. She'd be a great person for you to have on this show. And I can send you that. And she, one of the people she interviews is Bruce Perry, and he says movement grows the brain faster and more effectively than anything else. Yeah. I mean, it's scientific fact. Somatic awareness and, processing sensations is important, but movement, and I honestly don't know anybody other than dance movement therapists who are trained to work as intensively and extensively and exquisitely and implicitly and explicitly with movement from the moment, the impulse that precedes the movement, to the final moment where the movement completes itself. So, and that life is a movement, a thought is a movement, a trauma narrative is a movement, a life narrative, a beautiful life narrative is a movement. So all of that, I mean,
beautiful. Well, I've really enjoyed this. I've kind of talked a bit more than I normally do in interviews because I'm kind of really interested in the subject matter. And I really enjoyed getting to know you this way. It's been cool. In terms of kind of finding you and your stuff, what's the best website for people to go to?
So unfortunately, I'm right in transition. So www.restorativeresources.net is really outdated, but I'm about to launch ambergray.com. My website, my amazing website person is just waiting for me to do some final editing.
This isn't going to be up for a couple of months, so should I just put that on
ambergray.com?
Yeah, if it's going to be a couple of months before this is up, then that's going to be on the, that's the one I'll share with people.
Ambergray.com is the best place, yeah.
Cool. And lastly, do you have a final message about the body for everyone who's listening?
A final message about the body. I would say I mean, part of the thing that came up was just love. Like, I love your body. And then I thought, oh my God, that sounds so tacky. But I think it's really important to recognize that this is where we live. Our bodies is where we live. It's the site of all of our experience. So love it, live it, breathe it, ask it what it wants to do today.
That's beautiful. Coming from you, that's not tacky. I really appreciate it. So love your body. As good a message as any I've ever heard on here. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.